A very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Lana Wolf and I'm the co-founder and co-director of EdgeEffect and the moderator for tonight's session. Before we begin, I want to highlight a few accessibility features. Voice interpretation in English and Spanish is provided. For voice interpretation, you can select the language you would like in an audio channel on Zoom by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen. Once you click on the globe, you can either select English or Spanish. You might want to mute the original language just to hear only the chosen language. The CAT live captioning is available in English through an external link that will be regularly posted in the chat. If you have any questions with regards to accessibility, please use the Q&A to communicate with the moderator. Before we start, we want to clarify the house rules for this webinar. We are committed to the fullest possible participation of everyone, and we want to make sure that no one is put off by the actions, languages, and attitudes of others. The use of respectful and inclusive language is absolutely paramount in today's space. There is a zero tolerance policy on abusive and disruptive behaviour. However, we also have a content warning. The content during the next 90 minutes will include discussions involving physical and psychological abuse, sexual-based violence, discrimination of people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions, and sex characteristics. We often use the acronym SOGIESC in humanitarian settings. We want to make sure you're engaged in this session in a way that feels safe for you all. We are not live streaming this session on social media platforms, but we are recording the event, and video will be published on the co-organizers YouTube channel, website, and social media over the next few days. This means that the recording will also be available for the general public and potentially also to viewers in your home countries. Please take into account in case you have publicity concerns, or if you're planning to share information about your advocacy work during the session. All attendees have joined with the video turned off by default. The chat will be available during this session if you wish to ask questions. However, please use the Q&A button in the bottom panel of your Zoom screen. There will be a Q&A session towards the end of the event. Please know that your questions will be moderated by the hosts. So without further hesitation, let's begin. Welcome to the side event of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council on the inclusion of people with diverse SOGIESC in the humanitarian system. In 2020, the UN Human Rights Council adopted the resolution 4529 entitled Promoting, Protecting and Fulfilling Women's and Girls' Full Enjoyment of Human Rights in Humanitarian Situations. The resolution recognises that humanitarian situations have the potential to exacerbate pre-existing or to create new patterns and structures of discrimination, including multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and inequalities, resulting in a disproportionately negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights of women and girls. Amongst those women and girls are lesbian, bisexual, trans, intersex, and queer women and girls, whose diversity of sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics creates specific and often critical needs in humanitarian settings. In 2021, EdgeEffect completed a groundbreaking report with UN Women on the gaps in humanitarian response that leaves the rights, needs, and strengths of people with diverse SOGIESC unrecognised and unaddressed. This event and our speakers will highlight the need for a new global commitment to address these gaps, starting with women and girls with diverse SOGI. This event is co-organised by EdgeEffect and ILGA World, with the sponsorship by the Permanent Missions of Australia and Uruguay in Geneva, and with support from UN Women and the Centre for Reproductive Rights. I will now introduce tonight's speakers. We have Jeff Roach, Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of the Australian Mission in Geneva, Victor Madrigal-Borges, UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, Manisha is the Executive Director of Blue Diamond Society, Nepal's leading and largest LGBT rights NGO. Manisha was a member of the Regional Advisory Group for The Only Way Is Up. Emily Dwyer is the co-founder and co-director of EdgeEffect and the author of the report, The Only Way Is Up. And Maria Holtzberg is the humanitarian advisor for UN Women in the Asia Pacific. Maria's been a part of the humanitarian inclusion journey with Pride in the Humanitarian System to The Only Way Is Up. But firstly, I would like to introduce Jeff Roach, the Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of the Australian Permanent Mission in Geneva. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Lana. And what an important and timely discussion this is going to be today. Thank you very much to Emily from EdgeEffect, to Gabrielle from ILGA, and all the teams who are involved in organising the event today. Thanks to the Permanent Mission of Uruguay, UN Women, the Centre for Reproductive Rights, and to Lachlan Dawson in my team. And a big welcome to all of today's speakers. I really look forward to hearing what you have to tell us on this, as I say, timely and important theme. The work of the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as the work being done by UN Women, Blue Diamond Society, and EdgeEffect, they're critical to providing us with an evidence base which we can use to inform action and to advocate for better ways of including people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions and sex characteristics. The work that's being presented today, it's even more pressing in light of the evidence of what we've seen that COVID-19 and the exacerbating impact that this is having on people of diverse SOGIESC. Effectively, what we're seeing is the entrenching of already unacceptable legal, social, and economic inequalities. I was very interested to read about the work that EdgeEffect has done in Australia, in which, as part of our COVID-19 response, they were commissioned to do a report on the gaps and barriers for people with diverse SOGIESC, particularly around accessing cash-based assistance, which has been part of our COVID-19 response. And the report highlighted that people with diverse SOGIESC were at high risk of poverty and high risk of vulnerability due to a lack of formal employment, savings, access to bank accounts, and formal and informal safety nets. And as a result, this has ultimately been caused by the systemic and long-term discrimination and a habitual exclusion that the community has experienced. Additionally, what we've seen is with the design of some of these cash-based assistance programs is that the SOGIESC community has been left out. And if they don't, particularly if they don't have access to bank accounts or mobile phones. Additionally, what we've learned is that people with diverse SOGIESC can face barriers accessing appropriate healthcare information, vaccine services during the pandemic. And I think of particular worry is the risk of reprisals and intimidation when seeking care. That is just a COVID-19 experience, but of course, this is a much broader and much more profound problem. And every time that there is an emergency, a disaster, a conflict of some kind, we have the same challenges re-emerging and repeating themselves, where people with diverse SOGIESC face specific threats to their safety. That's why if we're going to meet the 2030 agenda about no one being left behind, that is the goal. It means that donors and aid organisations have to ensure that their support for COVID-19 recovery and the way they do humanitarian response protects the human rights and addresses the individual needs of persons with diverse SOGIESC. From an Australian perspective, we believe that all people, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics, are entitled to the same respect, dignity, and protection. That's one of the reasons we're a proud member of the UN LGBTI core group in New York, the Equal Rights Coalition, and the recently established Group of Friends of SOGI here in Geneva. And I know that many of the attendees of this side event today are members of the group of friends. Beyond what we're doing in places like New York and Geneva and through our work here, it's through our humanitarian program that I think we're going to be really focusing today. And this is an area where Australia has been promoting the participation and inclusion of people with diverse SOGIESC in humanitarian interventions, including through support for civil society organisations. And these civil society organisations are key to ensuring that people with diverse SOGIESC are safely and effectively included in disaster preparedness, disaster planning, and disaster response. As I've already noted, many lack the financial resources, staff capacity, or networks that CSOs need to properly engage. And we donors and humanitarian agencies, we need to find ways of supporting CSOs to do this. Australia is proud to partner with EdgeEffect to strengthen the capacity of diverse SOGIESC civil society organisations in the Indo-Pacific and helping them to engage with their national disaster response system and the international humanitarian system more broadly. In the Philippines, I know EdgeEffect has been providing staff and volunteers to BizDAC Pride, a local community service organisation. And that's been around training and support to engage people of diverse SOGIESC across their region, which is particularly prone to typhoons and other disasters. The partnership's also developing tools and training material to assist CSOs assess and support humanitarian actors to better consider the needs of people with diverse SOGIESC. BizDAC Pride has also created a global online resource called 42 Degrees that brings together a lot of these materials and projects for wider dissemination for the humanitarian and development sector. As we go forward, we all have a role to play in ensuring that humanitarian responses and development programming is sensitive to the needs of people with diverse SOGIESC, including by ensuring financial and technical support is there for relevant community service organisations, thus ensuring they're involved in humanitarian and disaster response. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Manisha talk from Nepal, and particularly interested to hear her testimony and that from other speakers as we try to unpack this particular problem. Because the research that we're going to hear today, it's going to be a really important contribution to this problem. We're not going to solve it in the next 90 minutes, but what I hope we do is we're going to create the shoots of growth, the shoots of experience, the shoots of information, and the shoots of coalition building that mean that all of us and those with whom we work with are able to make sure that what we do over the coming decade is going to be a lot better than what has been done in the preceding decade. This is really terrific work, and I'd like to thank EdgeEffect and Ilga for your work in pulling this together. We're thrilled to have been allowed to have been a co-sponsor of this event. Lana, I'll now pass back to you as our moderator and look forward to listening in on the next 90 minutes. It's going to be terrific. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Jeff. And it's really good to hear Australia's support for this work. And certainly EdgeEffect certainly works in partnership with the DFAT, and particularly in our humanitarian work. And we hope that that continues long and we do make some change in the world together. So thank you very, very much. Next up, we have Manisha talking, and Manisha is the Executive Director of Blue Diamond Society. As you will all know, she's up next because I'm a little bit unsavvy with IT and I accidentally put a chat out to everybody instead of just the panelists. But a very, very big warm welcome to Manisha, who's the Executive Director of Blue Diamond Society, member of the Regional Advisory Group for The Only Way Is Up, and was a part of Pride in the Humanitarian System. A very warm welcome, Manisha.
Yeah, thank you, Lana. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today to share about my experience, how we tackle the humanitarian crisis situation during the earthquake in Nepal in 2015 and current COVID-19 pandemic, and how I involved in the, the regional advisory group of regional research projects that is targeted to SOGIESC community and the humanitarian. And my organization is, the Working for the Rights and Health Issues of LGBTIQ people since 2001. And when earthquake happened in 2015 in Nepal, we are so confused and scared and not prepared to cope with this such natural disaster. And we have been focusing our activism, only on the prevention of HIV and AIDS, and then citizenship rights, marriage equality, and equal opportunity for education and employment. But we did not think about any intervention, that deals with the humanitarian crisis situation. And earthquake 2015 gave us a big lesson to us, and we lost our colleagues, friends, and many of our community members lost their relatives and their homes. And as I said, we were not prepared at that time, and we did not have any resources to support our community. In other hand, we had the great responsibility towards our community as we are running the LGBTIQ leading organization. And suddenly, we got the email from our global and regional supporters to encourage us to write the appeal to the international society. At that time, we don't have that much capacity to deal with such kind of humanitarian crisis situation, and how to write such, the powerful appeal to the international community. And after that, seeking support from our colleagues, and we sent the appeal to the community, and we get the support for our community, and we started to get the resources, and we organized our own campsite in front of our office and make the food and for our community friends. And we organized the funeral process for those who lost their lives, and we wrote a letter to UN agency, concerned stakeholders, and government of Nepal to have the meeting to hear the concern from our community. And later on, we got the support from the different LGBTIQ organizations like ELGA, Asia Pacific Transgender Network, APCOM, Outright Action during the COVID situation, and also in the disaster in the earthquake in 2015. And Nepal government, they organized the campsite that is only for the male and female and for the family. And we found that the many transgender people and non-binary people face the challenges to access those campsites during the earthquake. And we do not have the, the marriage equality rights, and it's again difficult to access the family campsite for us. So we self-organized the campsite in the Kathmandu and the hardest hit district around the, the Nepal. And we come to know that at that time that different, the cluster system where exist within the country with coordination with the UN agency and the government to cope this kind of disaster. And at that time, I thought that I always and try to they connect with those cluster system. At that time I was not success, and later on during this pandemic I'm the now connected with the cluster system that deals with the disaster. And since 2019 the to till date, we are facing the challenges from the COVID-19 pandemic. So far, the 22 of our LGBTIQ friends suicide because of the mental health issues and during the lockdown. And unequal distribution of the vaccine, they cause the challenges to access the vaccine from our minorities community, and many become infected and died. We lobbied for the vaccine for our community, and UNDP facilitated for us for the vaccine. And I was coordinating with UNDP, and suddenly, unfortunately, at that time, I was infected, and it's been 2 months now. I'm planning to have the vaccine soon. And in the initial phase of this pandemic, the government started to distribute the relief material, food material to the needy people only after showing the citizenship, and many transgender do not have the citizenship. And we raised this concern and sent a statement. And only after that, our lobby and advocacy, our friends started to get relief without showing the citizenship. And I have seen the challenges to access, the dignity kits and the sanitary pad for our transgender men and queer women. And many transgender people do not have access to hormone, for our hormone replacement therapy. It seems that this is the very small things for other, but these challenges are the big for us, and its impact to our health issues, and it's matter for us. And because of the family rejection, many of our community friends are living alone, and they don't have the property rights, and because of the lack of citizenship, they don't have the bank account, and they don't have the savings, as well as Jeffrey mentioned already. And many of our friends, they lost their job during the pandemic, and the many transgender sex workers faced, the challenges in the livelihood during the lockdown period. In other hand, we distributed the ART medicine through the home-based care approach for the HIV positive, our community friends. And the both of these situation, gave the lesson learned for us. Many LGBTIQ organizations are not prepared to cope with such humanitarian crisis situation, and the preparedness intervention are lacking. I think the donors should invest the fund to support LGBTIQ organization and other minorities organization for the preparedness. Emergency support is very much important, and many people, they ignore the support for during the emergency, and they only concerned about ongoing project, but not concerned to the emergency support. And research and study is also lacking. And when I attended the Pride in Humanitarian conference in Bangkok in 2018, my capacity has been increased to deal with the, the issues with the government and the humanitarian actors within the country. And many LGBTIQ organizations do not know who support us during this kind of situation. We need to provide such information and opportunity of support to the very grassroots level community. And many legal barriers like citizenship issues, the marriage equality issues, hinders us to seek relief assistance. And there's a link between the, the legal barriers and the accessibility of the relief materials, mechanism, bank account, and property right. And stigma, discrimination during the relief distribution, and massive awareness and sensitization is required, and unequal distribution of the vaccine is another challenge. And rich countries should think these issues, and if they donate the vaccine to the other country, not just donate, but they should ensure this donated vaccine relief assistance should go to the needy minorities people, including LGBTIQ people. And lack of research, there is a minimum information on LGBTIQ related to the humanitarian. I joined in the regional advisory group of one important regional research. I came together and collaborated on months-long period, the project to understand how people with diverse SOGIESC fit into the humanitarian system in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, Vanuatu, and Mindanao in Philippines. This regional advisory group was an opportunity to counter the ongoing invisibility of our communities in the humanitarian system. Through this collaborative process, we are not just participating, but using our lived experience and the experience of our community to shape the rich research outputs and recommendation. We need more and more research like this. And now I'm invited in the cluster system in my country from the UN agency and the ministry. This is very important for us to share our issues in the different cluster system. We need to empower our community to be in the country-led cluster system. And country disaster risk reduction, the plan exclude need of LGBTIQ people. We all have to advocate for this to be included in country's disaster risk reduction plan and management. Inclusion isn't, the one-time intervention or a rapid decision. It requires persistent and meaningful participation of our community who want to be a part of the design, planning, and decision-making process in the humanitarian system, because this process impact our life. We are supporting them in our very limited, the capacity to the decision-making body to provide our information I also want to add, that many of our South Asian LGBTIQ people, moved to Nepal because of threats in their country, and we are supporting them. The donor and UNHCR should support us and LGBTIQ friends who are in the refugee status for their, the resettlement and relief support. This is also one challenges that we are facing. So we need to think these issues, and these two incidents happened recently during 2015 in the earthquake, and the 2019 and 20 until now the COVID pandemic give the big lessons for us that I said, my thoughts, my story, our story to all of you, and we need to think about this key, the concerns, and we need to work together for the betterment of our community people to be included in any, the disaster risk reduction plan and relief assistance. Thank you, Lana, over to you.
Thank you, Manisha. And it's really important to have that lived experience as well as going through learning the technical experience. It's really important and really wonderful to hear that you're now part of the cluster system in Nepal. So thank you very much for sharing your experiences in the Nepali earthquake and in Nepal right now with COVID. But next we have a very warm welcome for Emily Dwyer, the co-founder and co-director of EduFect, and the person who is the author of The Only Way Is Up. A warm welcome to you, Emily.
Thank you very much, Lana. Distinguished guests, other people with diverse genders, sexualities and sex characteristics, allies, Jeff and Manisha. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for your comments so far. My job is to introduce the report, The Only Way Is Up, and to sort of take you briefly through that. But my presentation today really has one point. We know that people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, expressions and sex characteristics, or LGBTIQ people, we know that we have specific and serious needs in crises such as disasters and conflict and pandemics. But the humanitarian system collectively currently has no strategy for addressing this, no strategy. In many responses, people with diverse SOGIESC are simply ignored. In a handful of responses, individual champions within humanitarian agencies make things happen, often despite the system rather than because of the system. A few organisations, including UNHCR and our partner in this work, UN Women's Asia Pacific Office, have made efforts, but their efforts within the whole system tend to be isolated. We hear isolated success stories, such as that of Blue Diamond Society. But CSOs that work within the LGBTIQ community, even as they're trying to fill huge gaps, often do so with little or no funding and with little or no access to the architecture or decision-making of humanitarian responses. And all of that needs to change, and there needs to be a strategy. In doing the research for The Only Way Is Up, we were told that addressing diversity of SOGIESC is too controversial. Indeed, in some contexts, humanitarian organisations, including UN agencies and INGOs, international non-government organisations, actually choose to avoid discussing or addressing this issue because of the attitudes of governments and societies. And there are times where the risk of doing harm means that a more conservative approach is appropriate. Sometimes interventions may increase the risks for people with diverse SOGIESC to an unacceptable level. But often what we see are situations where it is possible for humanitarian actors to do more, but they don't. I guess The Only Way Is Up is an effort to understand how and why the humanitarian system behaves like this. And I should say we thank the Swedish government and UN Women for the funding for the report. Our CSO partners, Bandhu Social Welfare Society, VPride and BDEV, who did research, and of course members of our regional advisory group. Now, humanitarian settings take many forms. There's often a focus in our discussions about refugees, but humanitarian situations can include pandemics, Rapid onset disasters such as earthquakes or typhoons or tsunamis. It can include armed conflict and a complex mix of all of those crises, sometimes in the same place. And within those situations, different organisations are doing many different things, providing shelter, water and sanitation, food, non-food items, protection from violence, education, health, information, and so much more. There's a lot that's going on. The report, The Only Way Is Up, adds to the growing evidence that people with diverse SOGIESC have serious needs in these situations and often don't have access to those things. And there have been other reports from Haiti, from Kenya, Lebanon, Indonesia, Fiji, Bangladesh, and many other places. The Only Way Is Up provides detailed studies of humanitarian responses in Cox's Bazar, in conflict displacement and earthquakes on the Philippines island of Mindanao, and in Vanuatu after Tropical Cyclone Harold, collecting experiences of people with diverse SOGIESC and doing gap analysis of the responses. There is a clear pattern to the challenges faced by people with diverse SOGIESC in crises. Often it starts months, years, or even decades before a disaster or a conflict. In many countries, people with diverse SOGIESC are ostracised from families, from their faith communities, local communities and lands, may be bullied at school, have trouble finding safe and fair work. They may be discriminated against when accessing public services like health, harassed when walking down the street, targeted by law enforcement, criminalised by laws about their sexuality, not part of community decision-making processes, and so much more. And all of these experiences undermine their efforts to build dignified and resilient lives, families and communities. And then on top of that, a crisis happens, a disaster, a conflict, a crisis, sometimes that lasts years or decades. And when that happens, people with diverse SOGIESC are often starting from behind. And the discrimination they've experienced all of their lives doesn't just stop. Indeed, sometimes it gets worse. Other community members may make people with diverse SOGIESC unwelcome at aid distributions, harass them in shelters, blame them for causing disasters, for spreading diseases, or bringing cyclones as a kind of divine punishment for our supposed sins. I've included here on a slide just a few comments from people that we interviewed, or that Bandhu Social Welfare Society interviewed in Cox's Bazar, Rohingya refugees with diverse SOGIESC who had fled Myanmar. And as well as these comments, 73% overall of the 30-odd people that we spoke to reported experiencing violence because of their SOGIESC diversity. About 90% said they'd been treated badly by government officials. 77% said they believed they'd received less support because of their SOGIESC. In interviews for The Only Way Is Up, people told us they don't go to shelters because they expect harassment and violence. In many reports, people say when they're forced to cross borders, they risk harassment by officials. They may be supported from their own support networks. Governments carry the core responsibility for responses, but their laws, policies and staff often act in ways to exclude people with diverse SOGIESC. For example, policies that assume families for the purpose of aid distribution are all based around heterosexual relationships rather than a diversity of relationships, or maybe a group of 6 trans people living together in a flat. And these issues continue from relief to recovery, making it so much less likely that people with diverse SOGIESC will, as they say, build back better. A report will be presented, as Lana mentioned, to the 49th session of this council in March next year on the human rights of women and girls in humanitarian situations. And it's important to remember that many people with diverse SOGIESC are also women and girls, lesbians, bisexual women, intersex women, trans women, and others who are targeted because of their sexuality or gender, sex characteristics, or all of those. And so what is the international humanitarian system doing through all of this? The sad truth is that often it's sitting on its hands. Despite all of the rhetoric about reaching the most marginalised, of addressing need wherever it is found, despite gender and social inclusion programs, despite photo opportunities and Facebook posts during Pride Month, far too often the humanitarian system is not doing enough. And doing nothing can do a lot of harm. Our analysis from The Only Way Is Up highlights many of the gaps. For example, needs assessments in many humanitarian responses do not include us. So there's no data and our needs are not taken into account in the planning. And so when we're not included in the planning, we're not included in activities and nothing's done to address our needs. A lot of humanitarian organisations don't provide any training to their staff on diversity of SOGIESC, nor have they adapted their tools or their priorities. As one humanitarian shelter specialist told us during the research, I can't think of having a discussion with someone about LGBTIQ and shelter before. Often diverse SOGIESC CSOs are not included as partners, so other humanitarian organisations don't learn from us in our organisations and are not accountable to us. Guidance in thematic policy and practice documents in areas such as WASH or shelter often doesn't include us either. So if workers in those areas want to do something, there's no one to turn to, no documents to turn to. In The Only Ways Up, we also did a review of broader inclusion frameworks that, again, do not include us. There's no mention in the Core Humanitarian Standard or the Inclusion Charter from the Grand Bargain or the SDGs or many other frameworks. And certainly we can read ourselves back into those documents where they talk about all of society approaches or education or health for all. But when just about every other group is mentioned somehow except LGBTIQ, people start to get a message. And finally, funding streams also don't include us. So even when organisations want to do this work, it comes at the expense of doing something else. And so again, often doesn't happen. These aren't individual technical separate issues. It's part of a systemic problem. All of them reinforce each other. In fact, the humanitarian system has been described as a complex and adaptive system, and one of the challenges of a system like that is that it is impervious to change. We know that many people in the humanitarian system have open hearts and care deeply about their work, but by itself, that's not enough. For that matter, one report won't change things either. One training workshop won't change things. And certainly just adding the acronym LGBTIQ to the end of a long list of marginalised groups won't change things either. So what is the strategy? Well, The Only Ways Up makes recommendations for all levels of the humanitarian system, globally, in response situations, in different sectors, for governments and for different organisations. I'm going to quickly summarise these in 4 groups. Firstly, change needs to start happening inside traditional humanitarian organisations. Training needs to happen, tools need to be adapted, data collected, hiring and management needs to change. Research by the Global Interagency Security Forum found that almost 80% of aid workers who identify as people with diverse SOGIESC conceal this from their own organisations because they fear being discriminated against when it comes to international deployment opportunities. These things need to change. Second, we need a benchmarking system so that humanitarian programs can be assessed now and change can be tracked. And luckily, we've done that for you. As part of The Only Way Is Up, there is a tool for this benchmarking. It's ready to use. And a key aspect of it is that traditional humanitarian organisations, when they use the tool, need to do it in partnership with a diverse SOGIESC CSO. And when it was piloted in Cox's Bazar, UN Women worked with the Bandhu Social Welfare Society to do that. Why? Because it's not okay for humanitarian organisations just to assess themselves. Thirdly, diverse SOGIESC CSOs need to be brought into the system, into the architecture, into partnerships. The reality is that often they are doing humanitarian work, but the system just doesn't see them. Fourth and finally, there is a need for a global level process to concentrate attention on these issues. The humanitarian system has done this in other areas of inclusion, most recently for people with disabilities, where a task team was supported to create a charter and where interagency guidelines now exist. We need that for diversity of SOGIESC, but it needs to be substantially led by LGBTIQ organisations and people. So we're calling upon the humanitarian system, to the donors here, to OCHA, to Interagency Standing Committee agencies, allies, to join us in doing something about this. 10 years ago, this Human Rights Council affirmed that we have rights like any other person. And honestly, it's time for the humanitarian system to get on board. Change is hard, but it's possible, and the only way is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. And it was really interesting to juxtapose what you had to say about the report and the lived experience that Manisha went through. You know, it's incredibly important. I want to next introduce Maria Holtzberg, who is the humanitarian advisor for UN Women in the Asia Pacific and someone who's been on this journey since 2018 with us, with Pride in the Humanitarian System, and then with The Only Way Is Up. and then we'll have Victor. So very, very warm welcome to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Lana, and greetings, Manisha, Emily, Jeff. It's intimidating to come after such excellent input, and I take your point, Emily. At the same time, I also, in terms of us stepping up, and then I also share some of the challenges that you yourself have presented. So just to circle back very, very quickly, you have heard colleagues reference to this event on Pride and Humanitarian Action, which took place 2018. We are in 2021, and I believe that many of the recommendations that we are seeing from the report, The Only Way Is Up, are probably not where we would want to be if you had attended the conference 2018. And just to say, this was the first conference where diverse SOGIESC groups and communities were brought together and met with humanitarian actors to really unpack the various dimensions so eloquently presented by Emily and Manisha. And there was a call to action that came out as a result of that. I want to also acknowledge in that that particular event was supported by DFAT. It was led by EdgeEffect, IPPF, APCOM, ASEAN SOGI Caucus, and Asia Pacific Transgender Network. Together also, and with support from UN Women. So we are very proud of that engagement and that work. We are probably less proud that the progress and the stepping up to this call to action has been less than what we were hoping at that time. Maybe change is slow. So we're here now to talk about specifically this report, but also to highlight many of the challenges and maybe consider what we can do as a system to ensure change. We feel, but it's obvious because we were part of the part of this process. We feel obviously that the report is incredibly welcomed. It's very timely, and this is especially when we're looking at the COVID-19 and the pandemic response, which Manisha made reference to, as well as Emily. We agree that the global humanitarian system has not given people with diverse SOGIESC the recognition and respect that they deserve. And we also note that the system has not adequately enabled enjoyment of the human rights that they are entitled to. So these actions or lack thereof have reinforced violations of human rights at times, and we recognize this as you pointed out, Emily. So just historically, and again, we are reiterating, the system has failed LGBTIQ plus communities and sometimes exacerbated the harm caused before, during, and after disasters and conflicts. So we know this context. We are hoping that this report will set a new gold standard in this area, and making sure that we're shining light on the issues in an unprecedented way. And it also provides tools for the humanitarian actors. So there are potentially no excuses left anymore. I want to highlight that among those tools is the rapid assessment tool that Emily was presented before, where the emphasis is on the partnership with an LGBTIQ local organization to support the assessment that you are undertaking. From as humanitarians, we know that data gathering and evidence building is always a challenge. We know also that if you have this type of data and even qualitative information, this is something that we can go and advocate in other contexts, because disasters very often, even though the context is different, it follows a very similar pattern. The risks and to the hazards are quite same in many, many different contexts. Those who are vulnerable in one space are probably vulnerable in another space. So this is why we want to advance the type of tools as presented in this report. So again, we as humanitarians must be accountable to the people that we serve, and these are the people at greatest risk, and these are people very often among the SOGIESC community. And I think it's important to highlight that it's not really about how people with diverse SOGIESC should fit into the system's mechanism and methods, but also how the system can extend itself to cater to these needs. And this is where some of the pieces that Emily mentioned become especially important, including this rapid assessment tool, because it will ask the questions to highlight the needs that are so critical. You're looking at a slide right now, and it includes the recommendations. We wanted first to share this as UN Women's commitments to advancing. And I can say, as UN Women, we do stand by each of these recommendations, and we will make sure that from our side, we will do within the humanitarian space and what we can to advance these key elements that you're looking at in the slide. I think there are spaces where there has been some progress. The example from Cox's Bazar, where the organization Bandhu is co-chairing diverse people's subgroup under the Gender and Humanitarian Action Working Group, is a good example of at least highlighting or making sure that these issues are discussed. Manisha has been very active in the Gender and Humanitarian Action space in Nepal, and really highlighted and made it clear and put it into all types of advocacy that is being done for the humanitarian sector. It is not enough. This advocacy is not enough, and we recognize this, but it is steps, and it is voices that are being heard to some extent. I think just to share with you, and I think my time is up, that we as UN Women, we will continue both this generating evidence base to highlight these particular issues and really highlight the reasons for exclusion, the specific needs of diverse SOGIESC people. We will also continue to always support dialogue between diverse actors so that these issues are being put at the front and center. We want to, there was a mention about the importance of funding streams for community groups. We see this in the broader humanitarian space, where women's groups or women-led organization or girl-led organizations are very seldom provided with funding in humanitarian context. This UN Women is working to change together with other UN colleagues. And we will always, and we always see that diverse SOGIESC organizations are part of that. So if we have capacity and ability to provide funding for community organizations, for us, that includes also SOGIESC organizations. We recognize the importance of building capacity of these organizations to be able to respond and to play a role in preparedness. So you have our commitment as an ally and as a being part of both the humanitarian system, but also wanting to change it from within and from without. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I think it's a really good point to make that the system has to extend itself to cater for diverse SOGIESC needs, not the other way around. And that it is important to consider the tools and for humanitarian organisations to work alongside LGBTIQ CSOs. And I'm really happy to note that UN Women now has an LGBTIQ plus focal person for their programming. So we're keen to continue to make changes in the humanitarian system together. Next, I would like to introduce Victor Magicul-Barres, who is the independent expert on SOGI. We did introduce you a little bit earlier, Victor, and I know it's a horrendous time for you right now on the East Coast of America, but a very, very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Lana, and I hope that you can hear me well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. It's a wonderful privilege to be part of this conversation. And the time is not that harrowing. You would hope that by this stage we would all be experts in calculating time differences, but sometimes that ends up not being the case, particularly when, like me, somebody flew from 4 time zones behind yesterday. And I think that this is what happened today. I'm delighted to be able to join you, though. Thanks very much to the organizers, with particular reference, of course, to ILGA World and Edge Effect, and congratulations on the issuance of this very important report that has been presented by Emily and to which reference has already been made. I think that this idea of identifying gaps in human rights mechanisms and the machinery to protect minorities and prevent conflict is going to be one of the most pressing and also one of the most significant areas for achievement over the coming years. I also wanted to mention that I'm grateful that whoever decided the title for the report referenced the work of Otis Clay, a wonderful song for those of you who may not know it, a wonderful song from the 1980s that I very much enjoyed in its original version and then its dance version in 1988. And in fact, one that I had in my mind while I was preparing this conference, because somehow some parallels are drawn between its lyrics, and I'll mention that to you as I go along. Now, we all know that the United Nations has significant concern about the promotion, protection, and respect of the enjoyment by women and girls of human rights in humanitarian situations, including good practices, challenges, and lessons learned. And I think that this report is going to be a very significant contribution to the effort of creating a diagnostic and an identification of advice to states in this connection. I wanted, because of that, to make reference to some of the elements that are highlighted in Resolution 4529 concerning this topic. And it came to my attention that some of the elements reflected in the reasoning of that resolution actually appear to describe methodological and causation cycles that in very many ways are described in the report that we are discussing today, in a way where this report, in a way, provides not only already a series of answers, but quite importantly, also an inspiration as to how all of us could be working on this topic in the future. Resolution 4529 speaks of the recognition that humanitarian situations have the potential to exacerbate pre-existing or to create new patterns and structures of discrimination and inequality, and further undermine access to different sectors. And we all know that access to education, to housing, to health is disrupted significantly in humanitarian situations. And we also know that women and girls in all of their diversity are particularly affected by the way in which access is disrupted. Another element is the recognition that pre-existing human rights issues are further exacerbated in humanitarian situations. And again, we all know that women and girls in all of their diversity come to humanitarian situations in a field that is not level. And the very situation of systemic disadvantage in that field immediately provokes a series of consequences in the way in which women can relate to the humanitarian situation itself. The third element is the recognition that breakdown of infrastructure and services provisions and weakening of institutions that occurs in these situations interact with stereotype, stigma, inequality, and multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. And that this in itself prevents women and girls in all of their diversity to access to justice and remedy for human rights violations and abuse that they have experienced, undermining accountability. And I think that in presenting these elements, the arrival or the existing situation before the humanitarian situation, the realities and dynamics created during the humanitarian situation, and the particular impact that this has on access to justice and the different mechanisms that ensure accountability, make it very logical that in this resolution, and as in the work of, in general, facing violence and discrimination, it has become a very healthy pattern that the work also demands that root causes are examined and are addressed in the advice provided to states. And this is where I find a very significant point of connection between the work that has been carried out and the work of the mandate that I have the honor to take forward. Now, as you know, the mandate of the independent expert provides visibility to the way in which violence and discrimination occurs, and it also identifies manners in which states can receive advice in relation to public policy, legislation, and access to justice. We have done that in a series of reports and inquiries already when identifying the impact of stigma, discrimination in humanitarian crisis, and the institutional drivers of discrimination, of course, of which main ones are criminalization, pathologization, and exacerbation of stigma through religious-based discourse. And we have seen the very concrete effects of such patterns and root causes reflected in the manner in which people access services and goods during humanitarian situations. From the point of view of the mandate, of course, there are three pillars of work. This is how we face the issue when dealing with humanitarian situations. On the one hand, we work in the context and the logic and the framework of forced displacement, where our major thread of work is made concrete through our alliance with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, where we have completed convening a series of roundtables where over 600 persons with lived experience, defenders and activists invested hours and hours of work in providing a knowledge base so that we can take forward these issues. Then we have, of course, the context of armed conflict and the idea of how to work with these issues within the peace machinery and infrastructure of the United Nations. And finally, all of the situations of humanitarian emergency. 2 points in relation to this. I think that we need to be mindful about how the insertion of the concerns of violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, how the concerns of diversity in this field need to be inserted in the frameworks. And I think that we need to be mindful that in every case, there will be probably different institutionalities and different institutional frameworks that need to be referenced. And my point of departure is, of course, always the UN family and member states, as well as civil society. And within civil society, I want to particularly stress the need that major civil society organizations that operate in this field be quite deliberate in their efforts to insert, to incorporate approaches, frameworks, and methodologies to ensure that the concerns of diverse persons, including, of course, those in the sexual and gender diversity, are included at a political, at a programmatic, and as a follow-up and monitoring level of their activities. In that path, we are constantly drawing connection with the other 2 pillars of work of the United Nations. We are constantly drawing connections with the development agenda. And I think more and more we are realizing the need to draw connections with the peace architecture, as well as all of the UN mechanisms and machineries for humanitarian emergency response. And I think in this context, what we have found is that the most logical and the most concrete and pragmatic way of doing this work is to remind ourselves that when we speak of a human rights-based approach to these sectors, it actually means nothing more than the implementation of the principles of non-discrimination, participation, empowerment, and accountability to be applied in the decision-making process, and as I was saying, the implementation and monitoring and evaluation cycle of all actions taken. And what this means in a very concrete way actually relates to some of the main findings of this report. Once you begin to give texture and nuance to what it means to give concretion, to make concrete these fundamental principles in the human rights-based approach, one realizes, of course, that the principle of participation requires spaces at the design table, at the decision table, the idea that persons, communities, and populations that are going to be impacted need to be also represented in these processes in a useful and efficient way. That empowerment entails a number of safeguards to ensure that their contribution is going to flow through the decision process, and of course that accountability will be present in the way that the system renders its results and the way that they are evaluated. When it comes to the mandate, the most recent example that we have of the implementation of such a methodology is our work on COVID-19 response and recovery, where, as you know, we crafted advice to states under the framework of ASPIRE, an acronym that aims to advise states that acknowledgement of LGBT persons, support to LGBT organizations. Emily was talking about the importance of redoubling our efforts of support, protecting human rights defenders from further violence and discrimination, bringing indirect discrimination into the assessment tools as a real risk, ensuring representation in planning, execution, and monitoring activities, and finally, maintaining an evidence-based approach. And Maria and Emily were already talking about this in a very concrete way in all of the activities. This is the only way to abandon prejudice-based actions. I was therefore delighted to relate to this report, which I think takes one step further in providing pragmatic, practical advice in relation to these issues. I view it as completely consistent and reinforcing of the political determination to provide a human rights-based approach to all actions, and therefore not only ensuring the principle of non-discrimination, but also significantly furthering the enjoyment of the rights of persons affected by discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity in humanitarian situations. Very thankful for this invitation and very delighted to be part of the conversation. Thank you so much, Lana.
Thank you so much, Victor. And it is really important to note and highlight the multiple and intersecting forms of discriminations and inequalities that do result in disproportionately negative impacts on people with diverse SOGIESC, but also women and girls, including women with diverse gender histories, women with diverse sexualities, and women with all sorts of diversities, including lesbian, bisexual, trans, intersex, and queer women. And that it is a big system, and there's lots of different elements of the system, including women, peace and security, the development and humanitarian nexus, CSOs, so on and so forth. But thank you very, very much. We do have a small intervention from the Center for Reproductive Rights, Paola Salwendaja, the Senior Global Advocacy Advisor for the Center of Reproductive Rights, who are supporting this event tonight. So we have 2 minutes for you, Paola. Are you there?
I am. Thank you very much. Very grateful to all the organizers for making the time for the center to do a small intervention. And very grateful to the panelists for their wonderful interventions. And so I think just very quickly, the Center for Reproductive Rights has been long working on the intersections of sexual and reproductive health and rights, international human rights law, and international humanitarian law. And the reason why we decided to devote more resources and attention to this issue is mainly because we have seen that SRHR get overlooked in humanitarian situations with little to no accountability for SRHR-related violations and disruption in access to sexual and reproductive health services. And as has been highlighted many times over the course of this event and in your report and in resolution 45/29, conflict and other humanitarian situations exacerbate pre-existing systems of discrimination and also restrictive legislative frameworks pertaining to SRHR, thereby creating compounding crises that disproportionately affect groups and individuals facing intersectional discrimination, such as people of diverse SOGIESC. And what we also have seen is that SRH needs persist and often grow more acute in this context. In women and girls and persons of diverse SOGIESC do not stop needing access to contraception, information and services, care for STIs, maternal health care, counseling, and services for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and of course, safe abortion services. And when they do not have access to these services, many face adverse risks to their health and lives, including unsafe abortion, including increased rates of sexual and gender-based violence, and increased rates of violence, of types of violence against persons of diverse SOGIESC as well. But what we also have been able to observe is that there is little to no accountability for and access to remedy and redress for violations of human rights in humanitarian settings. And this lack of accountability is heightened for different reasons. First of all, accountability may be interpreted very narrowly, really just focusing on punishment of individual perpetrators of crimes, and not really having an understanding that is really enshrined in human rights. And this is why we were extremely happy to welcome the resolution 45/29 that has been adopted by the Council last year, because for us it provides an opportunity to actually develop a broader understanding of what accountability means, and to make sure that it includes, that is really very much enshrined in human rights, and includes access to reparations and transformative reparations, meaning that what we're really looking for is reparations and remedies that question and dismantles patterns of discrimination and oppression that enabled the violations to happen in the first place. For us, we see a need to strengthen networks, alliances, and partnerships for SRHR in humanitarian settings to address these challenges, including by breaking silos between different systems, between development, human rights, humanitarian, and peace-building sector actors, who might use legal and policy frameworks, but we really need to engage all together to ensure that there's a circle of accountability created around persons of diverse SOGIESC in humanitarian settings. So we look forward to continuing to work very closely with you and other actors to make sure that the next iteration of the resolution takes these elements into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paola from the Center for Reproductive Rights. We do have one question, and I will ask the panelists. We've got just 3 or 4 minutes to answer this one question. The question is from Ranaka, who says, "Thank you so much for an insightful presentation. I would like to know what your recommendations would be on the access of humanitarian assistance to minority of the minorities, vulnerable, disadvantaged SOGIESC identities, groups in hard to reach areas with little or no access to internet, who happen to have no representation and therefore tend to end up being misrepresented by those in advantaged positions." I open the floor to you, Manisha, Maria, Emily, or Victor, if you have an answer to this question.
Yeah, thank you, Renika, for the question. Yes, as I said before, that we need to coordinate with the vulnerable and the most marginalized the population within our community who are more vulnerable, and any humanitarian actors and the LGBTIQ organization, they should prioritize, firstly, they should prioritize the most vulnerable. Who are the most vulnerable? Who are the needy people? So that the needy people can access the relief assistance. And then, the LGBTIQ organization need to, they keep in touch and coordinate regularly with those people who are in the very remote area, who don't have the internet access. We need to coordinate regularly and prior to any humanitarian crisis season. So this makes us preparedness to reach out the needy people during the crisis situation. And during the crisis situation, we like, for example, Blue Diamond Society at the central level, we have to coordinate with the those minorities, people who are in the remote area, with the humanitarian actors in that local area. So that will help this coordination and communication. And the prior mapping is the very most important, and the prioritization is very much important to access the relief, relief assistance for those needy people. Thank you, Lana.
Thank you very much, Manisha. And it is a really important point that we need to build relationships before an emergency happens, so that when emergency happens, we can more readily know who those people who are more marginalised are. Are there any other answers, Victor, Emily or Maria?
I think, Victor, you've got your hand up. I'll just say something really, really quickly, which is that women and girls are often amongst those most marginalised and hardest to reach. And certainly we find in our research that it is very difficult sometimes. I think it's really important to recognise that the people with diverse SOGIESC are quite different. There's lots of different people within that group. It's also really important to realise that we're not victims, that there are often lots of informal networks that exist within communities, even when there aren't CSOs or other organisations working in those particular geographies. But of course, connecting into those informal networks is not always easy, and it requires sort of a longitudinal engagement. In the humanitarian system, there is often a tendency to parachute in, and then it's really hard to build those trusting relationships. So as Manisha said, working to build those relationships before a crisis happens is critical. Victor.
Thank you very much. And I'll take point of departure in something that Lana was already mentioning, which is the importance of acknowledging that in very many cases, experiences of privilege or discrimination and violence are created by the juxtaposition in one body of many different identities. This idea that intersectional analysis provides us with methodological tools to understand life experience. And something that this report does very well is it actually brings to a very concrete and accessible level the consequences of that reality by constantly making the point that we are not talking about a monolithic hegemonic group of people, that there is great texture in the way different persons, communities, and populations live their life. And there is also great nuance to the way in which they experience violence and discrimination. And I think part of what needs to be an approach, when I speak of participation, when I speak of evidence base, I am hoping that we all remind ourselves that a fundamental question when putting together decision-making processes, design processes, evaluation and monitoring is who has been left out of the room, who is not here that should be here. And to me, that will always be a continuing challenge, because as our colleague who expresses the question very accurately say, we need to even get rid of some preconceptions, such as the fact that people will have access to internet. So asking that question today would require us to answer, well, those that don't have access to internet today, those that are without connectivity, will actually not have access to this information and to the way that it can be taken forward. And so the next question that we would need to ask ourselves is, how do we then reach out to them and make sure that this information is available to them in different media, so that we can actually ensure that this is the case, and so that we can bring back their concerns, their realities, their feedback, and their opinion into the process, into the fold. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maria.
Thank you so much. And you will hear basically the same response as the others. So maybe we can just click here, stop. No, kidding. Just to say, I really like the point on minorities of minorities. I think that's a really interesting way to frame it. And it is one of those issues of how you and women are coming into this, because we look at this using a real intersectional framework and a feminist lens, because even within this community, as we all know, there are minorities that are also not being heard well enough. And I think one answer would be, do we have enough? I mean, the point that Emily mentioned on preparedness is essential. Do we know if the community groups that we want to work with, do they represent an intersectional lens? Will they speak, or do they have representation of diverse people? And if they don't, do you have other groups then that can really make sure that those voices will be heard? So we're not saying go to your friendly neighbor put LGBT organization and then tick the box and then you're done. It really means that we need to foster a full understanding of all of the different intersectional needs and make sure that all those voices are somewhere represented. I think the point on digital is so interesting because there are very many examples of how digital access, which is limited in one context, and I know that was the question, but digital is also the route to freedom in other contexts for others. So we should use these tools in the different ways. And my suggestion maybe to be concrete with those communities, those spaces that are so remote and where there's no access, we then need to make sure that the humanitarian actors who are there doing their vast needs assessment and traveling, etc., that they make sure that they ask and make sure that they do get the voices from people in remote areas, but representing these groups as well. That would be my concrete suggestions. And again, thanks for that excellent question that we all seem to agree was excellent. Over.
Yes. Thank you very much, Veronica, for that question. Now, we only have 6 minutes left, so I am going to ask our panelists for just a very quick closing remark. We will start with the original order. So maybe Victor, if that's okay, we'll ask you for your closing remark.
Thank you very much. I think that this process represents a wonderful opportunity to ensure that we begin to deliver on the process of ensuring that concerns and information, data, knowledge coming from the lived experience of persons impacted by violence and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity will come into design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and further information on the processes relating to the response for humanitarian situations. A few days ago, in a side event, Volker Turk, Assistant Secretary General Volker Turk, make reference to a process in which many of us are actively involved, which is reflections around the creation of a UN-wide strategy on the insertion of concerns based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And given the multiplicity of points of entry, and given the variety and texture that these issues has, I think I place a lot of hope in that strategic thinking that is being currently developed within the United Nations. And to me, reports such as the one that we are discussing today, and reports such as the one that is being prepared by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, will be essential building blocks in the not only the design, but also the cross-test for such a wide strategy that should reach all UN action and that should acknowledge that the concerns of sexual diversity and gender diversity are mainstream concerns at the UN and therefore should be treated as such. Thank you so much for preparing this great report. I will find it extremely useful for my work, and I thank you for that. Thank you so much.
A very warm thank you to you for joining us tonight or today. Manisha, a very quick closing comment.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, when we talk, about the gender issues, most of the humanitarian actors, define it as a woman and girls and men and boys, and they still use the gender binary lens and ignoring that other gender identity exists as well. There are the transgender people, non-binary, intersex people as well. And that's why it's crucial for the humanitarian system to use the SOGIESC and the feminist lens, and humanitarian system, they need to break away from their gender binary system and include the person of diverse SOGIESC, and they need to have the SOGIESC inclusive policy, and they need to have the strategic partnership with us. Thank you.
Very good point, Manisha. Emily, closing remark.
Yeah, I'd like just to start by thanking Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for supporting EdgeEffect's work, UN Women for the support for The Only Way Is Up, along with the government of Sweden. I'd like to recognise all of the diverse SOGIESC civil society organisations that we work with, and that, especially those that contributed to the report, and the regional advisory group who are part of Pride in the Humanitarian System. What we've been talking about today really is a group effort. I know that there are people within the group of attendees who are also champions of this work within their own organisations. And even though the work of organisations like UN Women in Asia Pacific and UNHCR is isolated, I know that you're out there. We would love to support you, and I think that we should be hopeful that we can bring a more systemic level of change to address these issues. Thanks.
Maria, any last comments from you?
Tiny comment. If reports is what we do, we will continue doing that, but I'm really, really hoping next time we meet, we will also start sharing some good examples of proper response that we have been supporting as UN Women, but also as a whole humanitarian system. So maybe you can hold me to account next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Jeff, as the co-sponsor of the Permanent Mission of Australia in Geneva, do you have any last remark?
Thanks very much, Lana. Look, so just to say that, you know, how proud we've been to be able to support this event. I've learned an incredible amount over the course of the last 90 minutes, and I must admit I'm a little unwell, so I have had my camera off and had my hot cup of lemon, sipping at it whilst I've been listening. But I'm struck by how persuasive, organised, and clear many of the advocates are on this issue. And I think, to pick up Maria's comment, when we come back together, and hopefully we can do it in person at some later date, to be able to show progress and to be able to look back on what we have done over the intervening period, I think will be really important. So thank you again to everybody for being involved.
Thank you very much. This event was co-organised by EdgeEffect in ILGA World, and I want to have a special thank you very much to Gabrielle and Danielle behind the scenes, who you haven't seen but has put in lots of hard work. And sponsorship by the Permanent Missions of Australia and Uruguay in Geneva, with support from UN Women and the Centre of Reproductive Rights. A big thank you to Victor Magical Borres, to Emily Dwyer, to Manisha Duckel, to Maria Holtzberg, to Jeff Roach, and to Paula Salwandaha, who gave an intervention. Please read the report if you haven't already. We hope that this has inspired you to do so. Please check out the link to the tool, and I will put up the screen of who you can email if you have any questions. You can email Emily Dwyer or Maria Holtzberg. Please visit UN Women or EdgeEffect, and I can play the music. Good evening and hello to everyone.